Imagine this: you've just lashed out at someone, maybe in anger or frustration. For a moment it feels like you've won, but as the hours pass, something begins to weigh on you. That weight, that gnawing feeling, is the cost of cruelty. It's not just about the damage you've done to someone else, it's about what you've done to yourself. In this speech, we'll uncover how cruelty eats away at the soul, and more importantly, how you can break free from its grip. Stay with me, because what we'll discuss could change not only how you see others, but how you see yourself. Cruelty corrodes empathy in ways that are both subtle and devastating. When you engage in cruelty, whether through words, actions, or even neglect, you aren't just hurting someone else, you're altering yourself, and not for the better. You see, empathy is fragile. It's this delicate bridge between your world and someone else's, allowing you to understand their experiences, their struggles, their pain. And cruelty takes a sledgehammer to that bridge. Let me explain. Empathy isn't just a feeling, it's a skill, one that requires practice, attention, and care. It's built in those moments when you stop and listen, when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, when you allow their reality to touch yours. But cruelty does the opposite. It hardens you. It tells you that their pain doesn't matter, that their story isn't worth hearing, that their humanity is less significant than your convenience or your anger or your fleeting sense of power. And here's where the damage becomes irreversible if left unchecked. When you allow cruelty to take root, it doesn't stop at the person you hurt. It begins to shape the way you see the world. You stop looking at people as individuals with rich, complex inner lives. Instead, they become objects, tools to use, obstacles to overcome, threats to neutralize. It's not just that you're unwilling to feel their pain. It's that you can't anymore. Think about that for a moment. What happens to a person who loses their ability to connect, to truly connect with others? They become isolated, yes, but more than that, they lose a fundamental part of what it means to be human. Empathy isn't just about understanding others, it's also about understanding yourself. When you cut yourself off from other people's emotions, you also cut yourself off from your own. That's why cruelty is so insidious. It convinces you that you're protecting yourself, that you're shielding yourself from vulnerability or weakness, but in reality, you're digging a hole, a deep, dark pit where your humanity used to be. And the deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to climb out. Let me give you an example. Imagine a parent who's constantly critical of their child, harsh words, dismissive comments, a refusal to acknowledge the child's efforts or emotions. At first it might seem like tough love, right? A way to push the child to be better. But over time, something happens. The parent starts to see the child not as a person, but as a project. They stop noticing the child's laughter, their tears, their unique way of seeing the world. The child becomes, in the parent's eyes, a reflection of their own frustrations and failures. And in the process, the parent loses something precious, the ability to truly love their child for who they are. Now, this isn't just about parents and children. This dynamic plays out everywhere in friendships, in workplaces, in marriages. Every time you choose cruelty over compassion, you're chipping away at your ability to connect. You're teaching yourself that other people's feelings don't matter. And the more you believe that, the harder it becomes to see the world any other way. But here's the most tragic part: the loss of empathy doesn't make you stronger. It makes you weaker. It makes you lonelier. Because no matter how much you try to deny it, deep down you crave connection. We all do. It's wired into us. We're social creatures. We need to feel understood, valued, loved. And when you destroy your own capacity for empathy, you also destroy your ability to receive those things from others. I think about the last time someone truly listened to you, really listened without judgment or interruption. How did it feel? Probably like a weight was lifted off your shoulders, like you were seen for who you are, flaws and all. That's the power of empathy. It's healing. It's transformative. And when you strip that away, not just from others, but from yourself, you're left with an emptiness that no amount of power or control can fill. And yet people still choose cruelty. Why? Because it's easy. It's easy to lash out when you're hurt, to belittle someone when you're feeling insecure, to close yourself off when the world feels overwhelming. But easy doesn't mean right. And it certainly doesn't mean good. Cruelty is a shortcut, but it's a shortcut to nowhere. It might make you feel powerful in the moment, but it's a hollow kind of power, one that leaves you more fragile and more broken with every use. Empathy, on the other hand, takes effort. It takes courage, it takes a willingness to be vulnerable, to open yourself up to the possibility of pain, but in doing so, you gain something far more valuable, a connection to others, a connection to yourself, and a life that's richer, deeper, and more meaningful. So the next time you're tempted to use cruelty, pause, take a breath. Ask yourself what kind of person you want to be, not just in that moment, but in the long run. Because every act of cruelty, no matter how small, leaves a mark. And every act of empathy does too. The choice is yours. When you harm others, you harm yourself in ways that are both immediate and far-reaching. This is a truth that people often ignore or deny, but it remains unyielding like a law of nature. Cruelty isn't just something you inflict outwardly, it's something you carry inwardly. Every harsh word, every deliberate slight, every calculated act of harm leaves a scar, not just on the person you've hurt, but on your own character. Think about it. What kind of person do you have to become to willingly hurt another? What do you have to suppress, ignore, or destroy within yourself to make that act possible? Because cruelty doesn't emerge from a place of strength. It comes from fear, from insecurity, from the desperate need to assert control in a world that often feels chaotic and unforgiving. And in that moment of cruelty, you trade a part of your integrity, your humanity, for the fleeting illusion of power. The cost is immediate, even if you don't notice it at first. Maybe you feel a brief rush, a sense of satisfaction, like you've won something. But that feeling is hollow. It doesn't last. And when it fades, what's left? Guilt, shame, a quiet, gnawing awareness that you've crossed a line you shouldn't have crossed, that you've done something you can't fully undo. And if you ignore that awareness, if you justify your actions or push them aside, you don't escape the damage. You compound it. Every time you rationalize cruelty, you weaken your ability to discern right from wrong. You become less honest with yourself, and when you lose that honesty, you lose the foundation upon which a meaningful life is built. Now let's take this further. When you harm someone else, you're not just harming them in isolation, you're damaging the relationship between you. Every act of cruelty erodes trust, and trust is the lifeblood of any connection. Without it, relationships become fragile, brittle, unable to withstand the inevitable challenges and conflicts of life. Imagine two friends. One day one of them lashes out. Maybe they're angry, stressed, or simply careless. They say something cruel, something that cuts deep. The other friend is hurt, of course, but they might not say anything. They might try to move past it, to pretend it didn't matter. But the dynamic has changed. A crack has formed. And unless that cruelty is acknowledged and repaired, that crack will grow. The friendship will weaken, and eventually it might break altogether. This isn't just about friendships, it's about every relationship you value, your family, your colleagues, your community. When you harm others, you isolate yourself little by little. You create a world where people are wary of you, where they keep their distance, where the connections that could bring you joy and meaning are severed. And here's the irony: the more isolated you become, the more likely you are to lash out again, perpetuating the cycle of harm. But the damage goes even deeper than that. When you act cruelly, you betray your own ideals. Almost everyone, if asked, would say they value kindness, fairness, and respect. These are universal principles woven into the fabric of every culture and society. They're what we aspire to, what we teach our children, what we rely on to create order and harmony in the world. So when you act against those principles, you create a rift within yourself. You become divided, a person who believes in one thing but does another. And that division is a source of immense suffering. It breeds anxiety, self-doubt, and a pervasive sense of dissatisfaction. You might not always be able to articulate it, but you'll feel it. A restlessness, a sense that something is off, something is missing. And here's the thing: the more you harm others, the harder it becomes to face that truth. You start building walls, defenses to protect yourself from the reality of your own actions. You blame others. You minimize the impact of what you've done. You tell yourself it wasn't that bad. But those walls don't protect you. They trap you. They cut you off from the self-awareness and accountability you need to grow, to heal, to become better. It's like poisoning a well. The water might still look clear, but it's contaminated. And every time you drink from it, you're ingesting the poison. That's what cruelty does to your soul. It taints everything, subtly, but profoundly. So ask yourself, what's the cost of harming someone else? Not to them, but to you. What part of yourself are you giving up? What opportunities for connection, for trust, for genuine strength are you sacrificing? And is it worth it? Because once you start down that path, it's not easy to turn back. It requires humility, courage, and a willingness to confront the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. And that's the real tragedy of cruelty. It's a shortcut, a way to avoid facing your own pain, your own fears, your own inadequacies. But in taking that shortcut, you don't escape those things, you amplify them. You carry them with you, heavier and more burdensome with every act of harm. This is why harming others harms yourself. It's not just a moral principle, it's a psychological reality. And if you don't recognize it, if you don't take responsibility for it, you'll find yourself trapped in a cycle of pain and destruction, unable to break free. Cruelty undermines the moral framework within which a person exists. It's not just about the act itself, it's about what that act represents and the consequences it sets in motion, not only externally, but within the individual who commits it. When you act with cruelty, you step outside the boundaries of what is right and good, even if only momentarily, and the repercussions are profound. You may think the act is insignificant, that it's contained, isolated, something you can justify or rationalize. But the truth is, every action shapes you. Every choice you make influences the person you become. The moral framework is like a structure that supports you, a framework you've either inherited or built over time, often unconsciously. It's constructed from your values, your beliefs, and the principles that guide your actions. And here's the thing, every time you act with cruelty, you weaken that framework. You chip away at it piece by piece. What happens when you justify cruelty? You tell yourself it was necessary, or that the person deserved it, or that it wasn't a big deal. But deep down, you know better. There's a voice inside you, a quiet, insistent voice that reminds you when you've crossed a line. And if you ignore that voice, if you suppress it or drown it out with excuses, you begin to erode your own integrity. That erosion doesn't stop with a single act. Cruelty has a way of growing. Once you justify it in one context, it becomes easier to justify in another. The boundaries you once respected start to blur. What was once unthinkable becomes acceptable, then habitual. And with each act, you lose a little bit more of yourself, your honesty, your compassion, your ability to distinguish right from wrong. And it's not just about you. When you act with cruelty, you send a message to the world about who you are and what you stand for. You show others that you're willing to harm, to manipulate, to exploit. And that changes the way they see you, the way they respond to you, the way they trust you or don't. But the damage runs deeper still. Cruelty creates a fracture within you. It sets up a conflict between the person you aspire to be and the person you've allowed yourself to become. That conflict breeds guilt, shame, and a sense of unworthiness. It makes it harder to look in the mirror, harder to face yourself with honesty and acceptance. And if you don't confront that conflict, if you don't take responsibility for it, it festers. It turns into cynicism, resentment, and self-loathing. It becomes a barrier between you and the life you could lead, the relationships you could have, the peace you could feel. This is the true cost of cruelty. It's not just what it does to others, but what it does to you. It undermines your moral framework, the foundation of your character, the compass that guides you through life. And without that framework, you're adrift. You lose your sense of direction, your sense of purpose, your sense of who you are. But here's the thing, this process is not irreversible. Just as cruelty can erode your moral framework, acts of kindness, accountability, and self-reflection can rebuild it. It starts with the choice of decision to take responsibility for your actions, to acknowledge the harm you've caused, to commit to doing better. And that's not easy. It requires humility, courage, and a willingness to confront the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. It requires you to listen to that quiet, insistent voice inside you, the one that knows when you've gone astray. It requires you to hold yourself to a higher standard, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one else is watching. But the rewards are worth it. When you rebuild your moral framework, you reclaim your integrity, your self-respect, your ability to live in alignment with your values. You create a foundation that's strong and stable, a compass that points you toward a life of meaning and purpose. And here's the most important part: when you strengthen your moral framework, you don't just change yourself, you change the world around you. You become a source of stability, a model of what it means to live with honesty, compassion and courage. You show others that it's possible to rise above cruelty, to choose connection over harm, to build rather than destroy. This is the challenge we all face every day in every interaction: to act in ways that align with our values, to uphold the principles that define who we are, to resist the temptation to harm even when it feels justified. It's not easy, but it's necessary, because our moral framework is all we have. It's what gives our lives meaning, our relationships depth, our actions significance. It's what makes us human. Cruelty doesn't just erode the bonds between people or diminish the moral framework of the individual, it also corrodes the essence of what it means to have a purposeful existence. When you act with cruelty, knowingly or unknowingly, you invite chaos into your life, not only in the external sense, but in the deeply personal, internal one. That chaos disrupts the sense of meaning and order that is essential for a fulfilling and stable life. Meaning is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's the anchor that keeps you grounded when life becomes turbulent. It's what allows you to bear the suffering that is inevitable in the human experience. Without meaning, you're left adrift in a sea of confusion and despair, with nothing to guide you, nothing to hold on to. And cruelty. Cruelty is the antithesis of meaning. When you're cruel, you reject the principles of responsibility, kindness, and connection principles that form the foundation of a meaningful life. You choose instead a path of destruction, a path that undermines not only the well-being of others, but also your own capacity to find purpose and fulfillment. The thing about meaning is that it's not something you stumble upon by accident. It's something you build brick by brick through your actions, your relationships, and your choices. Every time you choose cruelty, you knock a brick out of that structure. You destabilize it. You create cracks that, if left unaddressed, can cause the entire thing to collapse. You might think you can compartmentalize, that you can be cruel in one area of your life while maintaining meaning in others. But that's not how it works. Cruelty seeps. It spreads. It affects the way you see yourself, the way you see others, the way you see the world. It changes you, often in ways you don't notice until it's too late. When you act with cruelty, you tell yourself a story that justifies your actions, that paints you as the victim or the hero or the one who had no choice. But those stories are lies, and deep down you know it. You feel it. You carry the weight of that knowledge even if you don't acknowledge it. And that weight makes it harder to find meaning. It drags you down. It clouds your judgment. It erodes your sense of self-worth. And when your sense of self-worth is diminished, it becomes even harder to act in ways that are meaningful. It's a vicious cycle. Cruelty leads to guilt. Guilt leads to despair. And despair leads to more cruelty. Breaking that cycle requires an immense amount of courage and effort. It requires you to confront the truth about your actions, to take responsibility for the harm you've caused, and to commit to a different way of being. But here's the hopeful part: meaning can be rebuilt. No matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how far you've strayed, it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose kindness over cruelty, to choose creation over destruction, to choose connection over isolation. Rebuilding meaning starts with small, deliberate actions. It starts with acknowledging the impact of your choices, both on yourself and on others. It starts with taking responsibility, not just for what you've done, but for who you want to become. It starts with deciding that you're not going to let cruelty define you, that you're going to strive for something better, something higher, something meaningful. And that's not just about avoiding cruelty, it's about actively choosing to make the world a better place. It's about using your words, your actions, your presence to create value, to build relationships, to support and uplift the people around you. It's about finding purpose in the service of others, in the pursuit of truth, in the creation of beauty and goodness. This isn't easy. It requires effort. It requires sacrifice. It requires you to face parts of yourself that you might rather ignore. But the alternative, a life devoid of meaning, a life defined by cruelty and chaos, is infinitely worse. Because without meaning, there's no foundation. There's no direction. There's no reason to keep going when things get hard, and they will get hard. Life is full of suffering, full of challenges and pain and loss. But it's also full of opportunities to learn, to grow, to connect, to create. And those opportunities are where meaning is found. Cruelty blinds you to those opportunities. It narrows your vision. It traps you in a cycle of negativity and despair. But kindness opens your eyes. It expands your perspective. It shows you the possibilities that exist even in the darkest of times. And that's why rejecting cruelty is so important, not just for the people around you, but for yourself, for your own sense of purpose, your own sense of meaning, your own ability to live a life that's worth living. Because at the end of the day, meaning is not just about what you achieve or what you acquire. It's about who you are. It's about the impact you have on the world, the legacy you leave behind, the way you make others feel. Cruelty leads to isolation in ways that are both gradual and devastating. It's not always immediate, it's not always obvious, but over time the pattern becomes undeniable. Every harsh word, every manipulative act, every moment where you choose to disregard someone's humanity, it all adds up. It creates a distance, a gap between you and the people around you, and that gap grows, slowly at first but steadily, until one day you look around and no one is there. And it's important to understand how this happens, how cruelty, even small and seemingly insignificant acts, can unravel the threads of connection that hold your relationships together. People are resilient, yes, but they're not unbreakable. When you hurt someone, especially someone who cares about you, it's like planting a seed of mistrust. At first, it might not seem like much. Maybe they forgive you. Maybe they tell themselves it was just a bad day, a moment of weakness. But that seed doesn't just disappear. It stays there, buried beneath the surface, waiting. And if you're cruel again and again, that seed begins to grow. It turns into doubt, then resentment, then a deep and unshakable belief that you're not someone they can rely on. What's so tragic about this process is how avoidable it is. Most people don't set out to push others away. They don't wake up one morning and decide to sabotage their relationships. But cruelty isn't always deliberate. Sometimes it's thoughtless, it's an offhand comment, a dismissive gesture, a refusal to acknowledge someone's pain. It's the little things, repeated over time, that do the most damage. Think about the people closest to you, your family, your friends, your partner. These are the people who see you at your best and your worst. They're the ones who are most vulnerable to your cruelty because they care about you, because they trust you. And when that trust is broken, it's not just a relationship that suffers. It's you. Because here's the thing, relationships are a mirror. They reflect back to you who you are. They show you your strengths, your weaknesses, your capacity for love and kindness and growth. When you isolate yourself through cruelty, you lose that mirror. You lose the opportunity to see yourself through someone else's eyes, and that loss is profound. It's easy to tell yourself that you don't need anyone, that you're better off alone. But that's a lie. It's a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the pain of acknowledging what you've lost. Human beings are social creatures. We're wired for connection. We need each other not just for survival, but for meaning, for purpose, for joy. When you isolate yourself through cruelty, you cut yourself off from those things. You create a life that's smaller, lonelier, less fulfilling. And the worst part, you might not even realize it until it's too late. Until the people who once cared about you have given up. Until the bridges you burned are nothing but ashes. Until the silence around you is deafening. But why do people choose cruelty in the first place? Often it's because they're hurting. They feel powerless, so they lash out to regain a sense of control. They're afraid of being vulnerable, so they push others away before they can be hurt. They're carrying wounds they don't know how to heal, and instead of facing them, they inflict those wounds on others. It's a vicious cycle. Hurt people, hurt people, hurt people. And every act of cruelty, every moment of isolation deepens the pain that started it all. It's like trying to quench your thirst with salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. The more you push people away, the more alone you feel. And here's where the spiral tightens. Isolation breeds more cruelty. When you're disconnected from others, it's easy to lose perspective. You stop seeing people as individuals with their own struggles and emotions. They become abstractions, obstacles, enemies, and in that mindset, cruelty becomes not just a choice, but a habit. It's a downward spiral. And the deeper you go, the harder it is to climb back out. But here's the truth: no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how many people you've pushed away, it's not too late. You can choose differently. You can break the cycle. But it's not easy. It requires humility. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to face the pain you've been avoiding, to take responsibility for the harm you've caused, to rebuild the connections you've broken. It requires you to look in the mirror and see not just the person you are, but the person you could be. And that's terrifying. It's so much easier to blame others, to justify your actions, to cling to the belief that you don't need anyone. But that path leads nowhere. It leads to loneliness, bitterness, regret. The alternative is hard, yes, but it's worth it, because when you choose connection over cruelty, when you choose to build rather than destroy, you open the door to a life that's richer, deeper, more meaningful. A life where you're not just existing, but truly living. The ripple effect of cruelty is a phenomenon as real and profound as throwing a stone into a pond. The initial act might seem small, insignificant even, but the ripple spread, radiating outward in ways you can't always predict or control. This is the nature of cruelty. It doesn't stay contained. It expands, it multiplies, it infects. And the consequences, often unseen by the one who set it in motion, can be devastating. Let's start with the immediate impact. When you're cruel to someone, whether through a word, an action, or even a lack of action, you plant a seed of hurt. And that hurt doesn't just sit there, it grows. It takes root in the person you've harmed, shaping the way they see themselves, the way they see others, the way they see the world. Maybe they carry that pain with them into their next interaction. Maybe they snap at a loved one or withdraw from a friend. Maybe they lose a little bit of trust, a little bit of hope. And what happens next? That loved one, that friend, now carries their own burden of hurt. They might not even know where it came from, but they feel it. And they too pass it on to a colleague, a stranger, a child. This is how cruelty spreads like a virus. It moves from person to person, altering lives in ways that are often invisible but deeply felt. It's easy to underestimate the power of this ripple effect. After all, how much harm can one cruel comment really do? But think about it. Words have weight. Actions have weight. And when that weight is negative, it drags people down. It pushes them further from the connections, the confidence, the courage they need to thrive. Take a workplace, for example. One harsh critique from a boss might seem minor, just a momentary lapse in kindness, but to the employee on the receiving end, it can feel like a blow to their self-worth. They might carry that feeling home, snapping at their partner or withdrawing from their children. And those interactions in turn ripple outward, affecting the dynamics of a household, community, even a society. This isn't just speculation, it's human nature. We're interconnected, whether we like it or not. Our actions, our words, our choices, they don't exist in isolation. They're part of a web, a network of relationships and influences that stretches far beyond what we can see. Now let's consider the broader implications. When cruelty becomes a pattern, when it's allowed to take root in a culture, a community, a family, it creates an environment of mistrust and fear. People become guarded, defensive, unwilling to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is the foundation of connection. Without it, relationships suffer. Cooperation breaks down. Progress stalls. This is why the ripple effect of cruelty is so dangerous. It doesn't just harm individuals, it harms systems. It erodes the very fabric of society, the bonds that hold us together. And it does so quietly, insidiously, often without anyone noticing until it's too late. But here's the thing, the ripples of cruelty are not inevitable. They're not unstoppable. Just as one act of cruelty can spread negativity, one act of kindness can spread hope. The same interconnectedness that amplifies harm can also amplify healing. Think about the last time someone showed you unexpected kindness. Maybe it was a stranger holding the door for you, a friend offering a listening ear, a colleague going out of their way to help. How did it make you feel? Lighter, probably? Stronger? More willing to pass that kindness on to someone else? This is the antidote to the ripple effect of cruelty, the ripple effect of compassion. It starts small, just like cruelty, but it grows, it spreads. It creates a chain reaction of positive change, touching lives in ways you might never see but can trust are happening. And that's the choice we face every day, in every interaction. Do we contribute to the cycle of harm, or do we break it? Do we let our frustrations, our fears, our insecurities drive us to cruelty, or do we rise above them? It's not an easy choice. Kindness requires effort. It requires restraint. It requires the courage to be vulnerable, to open yourself up to the possibility of rejection or misunderstanding. But the rewards are immeasurable. Because when you choose kindness over cruelty, you're not just helping the person in front of you. You're helping everyone they'll encounter, everyone who will be touched by the ripples of your action. You're creating a world that's just a little bit brighter, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more human. And isn't that what we all want? To live in a world where people see and value each other, where the bonds between us grow stronger rather than weaker. It starts with a choice, a single, deliberate act of compassion. A choice to break the cycle of cruelty and replace it with something better.